Hi, everyone. Thanks again for coming. So, some people that attended the last seminar did show some interest in behavioral economics, and so I got excited because I thought, great, that'll be me that'll do this. And so we'll just kind of talk about what the scope of behavioral economics, what that kind of includes, kind of define it, and then talk about some ways that you can bring that into your classroom. Again, we'll do a short activity that you'll be able to find in your packet, and we'll actually play that game at the end here, and then we'll kind of come back after we play the game and kind of discuss what happened to get an idea of different discussion points you can talk about in your class. So let's see. Yeah, okay. All right, so what is behavioral economics? How can we incorporate it into our classrooms? Okay, so behavioral economics is basically just a method that we use to explain and predict people's behavior. And oftentimes it just gets really interesting because we can explain how our behavior sort of contradicts what we would typically explain to students how behavior would come out when we make traditional economic assumptions. So we kind of make this overarching assumption in economics that people are rational thinkers and that they weigh costs and benefits appropriately, and they kind of use these analytical thinking skills to make decisions. But what we find in real life is that actually it's not always true. So we find that people are often irrational thinkers, and they kind of violate these traditional economic assumptions that we make. So we talk about, biases that come out of people making emotional decisions or making decisions based on their personal experience, or they use certain social constructs to make decisions, which all can actually violate our traditional economics. Okay, and so kind of to understand those biased decisions, we kind of pull in some theories from cognitive psychology. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. So if you guys can pull this into your classroom in any way, shape, or form, I think it's really great because, for one thing, students get interested in it. It grabs their attention quickly, and it also creates some room for some great interdisciplinary discussions. So we had some people in here that maybe teach psychology, was that right? If you teach any kind of science-related courses, even personal finance, you can bring in discussions about how people make poor choices when it comes to retirement savings, because they're not understanding kind of the economic implications of the future, and they're not taking into account future events appropriately. Also has to do with marketing. So if you teach a marketing course, some great interdisciplinary discussions there. And also it just kind of brings in a new way to look at economics that's interesting and fun, and you can kind of get creative with it. Okay, so I always like when I bring this into my classroom, if I get a chance to do it, I always take some time just to kind of divert from traditional textbook stuff and kind of bring in something fun that they can get interested in. And these are the two textbooks that I like to I'm sorry, not textbooks, but just reading sources that I like to direct them to. So the first one is a book that Daniel Kahneman wrote. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And so it's a bit more of a technical book. And so Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner, and he is famous for his theory that's called prospect theory. And so it's kind of this idea that people operate in a way that's kind of violates traditional assumptions that we make in economics, and it's the idea that people are very loss averse. Okay, and so actually the book that I like even more than that is written by Dan Ariely, and so this book is very accessible. So this is a book that you could even assign your students to read. They're not going to have any problem. It's not technical at all. It's very each chapter is a nice narrative. He talks about several little experiments that he does with his own students and just out in the public in general that are just really fun and interesting. And so with that book, he actually has short videos that go along with each chapter. And so if you don't actually assign it as a reading, you can kind of just show the short videos that he has on his website. And so I'm just going to go there real quickly and show you a video. I'll pick one that I think is nice. Okay, and so here's his website with his short videos. And then he has chapter by chapter short videos that go along with his book. And so this is just one of the videos that I happen to like. Okay, sorry that was so quiet, but hopefully you could hear part of it. And it's just, yeah. So just this idea that in the way that information comes to us, like the way that it's framed, so this is like a great video to kind of show if you're talking about different marketing strategies, right? Because we see companies like Amazon doing this all the time, right? Where the amount that you're paying for a good, in the end, may be the same, but our choice as a consumer can differ greatly depending on how that information on the pricing structure is displayed to us. Okay, so here he was showing that 3 different pricing structures, exactly the same in the end for the consumer, but their choice to actually purchase that good is quite different if they're presented with the last case, where that was the case where the product is displayed as free, but then you have this extra shipping cost. And consumers actually see that as a very attractive choice compared to the others, even though it's no different. So that's where we see our kind of traditional economic thinking kind of going out the window, and people just making what we'd call an irrational choice just because it's displayed differently to them. Okay, and so he has some different, this one, the fallacy of supply and demand, talking about how people kind of, if you think about consumers, they'll kind of develop patterns in their consumption choices that kind of go against our traditional demand theories, and they just kind of peg themselves as a certain type of consumer, and so they kind of fall into a consumption pattern. So that's kind of interesting. He has a chapter that talks about procrastination. And so he does a little experiment with his own college class and gives the students an assignment. It's a paper, and says, okay, you have to write this paper throughout the semester, and I'm going to give you a choice of 3 different deadlines, and then you have to choose which deadline it is that you want. So he gives them the choice, like you can pick, 2 weeks into the semester, I'll have it done and turn it in. 8 weeks into the semester, I'll have it done and turn it in, or by the end of the semester. And so he kind of looks at what students choose and how successful they are in actually sticking to those deadlines. And so it's all about procrastination. And if you have students like I do, then this is a really interesting thing to talk about, just kind of how people tend to not do things that are good for them, even though they know they should. And so again, that's kind of something that would relate to your personal finance courses as well, because you can talk about how we procrastinate in saving for ourselves, and kind of get into that element of time, like we're really losing out on time when we decide to procrastinate on saving, because it's not necessarily our interest earnings that make us the big bucks. It's kind of, if we get in early into saving, it's that time factor of time that's going to grow our money more. Okay, so those are kind of some interesting things you can show and just get a discussion started with your students. So let me go back here. Okay, and I have a couple other videos here that kind of go along with some of the concepts in the Kahneman book as well, and I might come back to those in a little bit if we have time. So kind of relating to that Daniel Kahneman book, he kind of describes our thinking in 2 different ways. He says we either follow system 1 thinking or system 2 thinking. And so system 1 thinking is basically just making quick kind of gut reactions and not really thinking through the consequences. Whereas system 2 thinking is more in depth. We're making analytical choices. We're looking at costs and benefits. So kind of the idea is that if we were to use system 2 thinking, then we probably would conform with what our economic theory of behavior would say that we would do. Unfortunately, people often don't use system 2 thinking, and so that's where we kind of get these differences in behavior. Okay, so those are just some of the characteristics of system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is just very emotional, you're making impulsive choices. System 2 is more analytic, you're making a more effortful choice. Okay. Another way to show it is Homer and Spock. So that's a good way to kind of illustrate the difference between those types of thinking. And actually most people wouldn't like to admit that they're more like Homer, but it kind of shows in the data that we are. So when we do little behavioral type experiments, we find out that people just respond to the environment around them and don't really kind of analyze the consequences. Okay, and so this is a chart that's coming out of the lessons from Econ EdLink, and we can talk about that Econ EdLink resource a little bit later. But if you were to go to Econ EdLink and search for behavioral economics in just the search bar, you would find 5 different lessons on behavioral economics. And what I'm going to be doing is relating to lesson 5. But here's kind of a chart that breaks down each of those lessons. And it shows you, here I'll point up here. So it shows you within those lessons how the typical economist would think. So if we're using that system 2 type thinking, these are kind of characteristics of how we would think. And then this is how people actually behave just as humans. And so with lesson 5, we're going to be doing an activity. And so we'll see kind of when we do that activity that an economist would use only the costs and benefits to make decisions. But in addition to that, people in general don't just use costs and benefits. They often factor in other things like emotions, such as fairness, to make their decisions. And so that's where we kind of get a deviation from the economic result that we're looking for. Okay, lesson 4 was the lesson about procrastination. So if that's something you like to talk about, it's kind of talking about costs and benefits of future events and how we kind of discount future events, and so you can talk about procrastination as it relates to savings. That's what that lesson is all about. So yeah, there's just some other good resources there. If you don't like my specific lesson that I picked, you can look at any of those other ones to choose for yourself. Okay, so like I said before, behavioral economics kind of draws from cognitive theory and behavioral psychology to get kind of the theoretical framework for how it is that people think. And then we use those theories to explain why people are deviating away from economic theory. Okay, so it's like, why is it that people don't reach the economic result that we want? Well, we kind of steal the theories from behavioral psychologists to explain why they're making bad choices. And so these are just kind of some of the concepts that you could bring into your classroom and talk about, you know, what are these biases in our judgment? Where are they coming from? And they all kind of have these fancy titles, and we can talk about a few of them. So anchoring is something, or we call it the relativity trap, is something that happens when information is displayed to you in kind of that way that we saw in the video. So if you see, let's say you walk into the store and see the price for a good that you're like, say you're going in to buy a flat screen TV, and you see a price slapped on that flat screen TV, and there aren't really any other TVs around. You just see a price for that TV, and you're like, kind of as a consumer, I'm not sure if I'm willing to pay that price or not. It doesn't really, You don't have anything to kind of compare to, right? But now what the store is going to do is they're going to put a TV right next to it, and they're going to slap maybe a higher price on a very similar TV. Now all of a sudden as a consumer, you have a frame of reference, and so you are going to have information to kind of compare the two TVs, and now you say, oh yeah, that TV looks really attractive, it looks like a good deal, just because there's a higher price TV next to it. And so that's the kind of idea of this anchoring, or like this relativity trap. Confirmation bias is another one that I like to, my pointer is going AWOL, is another one that I like to talk about. Have you guys ever heard of confirmation bias? Do any of these kind of ring a bell? So if you, teach a psychology class, maybe this is something that's come up. So confirmation bias is basically the idea that when you go out to research information about something, you are going to maybe fall prey to this confirmation bias because you have kind of these pre-existing beliefs about something, and then when you go out to research it further, just subconsciously, it's your tendency to ignore or discredit information that does not support what you already believe, but you will kind of seek or confirm or give credit to information that supports or confirms what you already believe. Okay, so even though those sources might be equally credible, you're just going to kind of fall prey to that and just kind of ignore the stuff that doesn't confirm what you already believe. Okay, and it's also known as cognitive dissonance. And that the idea of cognitive dissonance is like, it kind of gives us this icky feeling when we go out and look for something or research something, and we find out that, oh, what we thought from before it's not true. It gives us this kind of icky feeling in our brain, and we just don't want to believe it, so we just kind of push it out. Gambler's fallacy is an interesting one. So that's kind of the idea that we fall into this gambling trap because we don't look at the games properly. And so the kind of classic example of that is like if I tossed a coin for all of you 5 times and each time it came up heads, and then the next time I'm going to toss it, I say, okay, what do you guys think it's going to come up as, heads or tails? Yeah, it's got, right? Ask your students that. They'll be like, it's got to be tails. Like, I'm sure it's going to be tails because it was heads the last 5 times. Like, surely it's going to come up tails. And so they would improperly weight the probability of that 6th toss toward heads, even though we know that statistically each toss is independent, and so that 6th toss, it's still 50-50 whether it's heads or tails. I shouldn't really say that there's more of a chance that it's going to be tails on the 6th time. So that's kind of an interesting little discussion to have with your students, or an example to give them to get them thinking about how our kind of understanding of probability rules is flawed. Post-purchase rationalization. Ask my husband, that's like, I do that all the time, right? I buy an expensive pair of jeans or something and I come home and he's like, are those really better than the jeans you already have? Oh yeah, because they have nice pockets and like I can wear them anywhere. And I just kind of try to find all of these explanations for why I made a good purchase, even though it might not have been a good purchase at all. Neglecting probability. That is where we kind of neglect probability in the sense that we maybe think that certain events are more probabilistic than others, just based on what we hear in the news or kind of our personal experience. It's kind of this, the example that we would give is that somebody gets in their car and has no problem driving to work an hour each way every day. They make that commute. It's no big deal. They're not afraid at all, but they won't get on a plane to fly across the country. So even though the probability of getting in a car accident on your way to work every day is greater than the probability that you would get in a plane crash, people have this kind of fear that plays in, and so they improperly think that a plane crash is more likely than a car crash. So that's that bias in your decision making. Negativity bias is also an interesting one. It plays in with when we watch our cable news, like why is everything framed in a negative light? It's because research has shown that people like negative news, that we respond more to negative news. So if something is framed in a negative light, for whatever sick reason, we like that. So that's going to get the viewer's attention. Okay, so those are kind of some of the things that you could bring in from a psychology perspective. And then just to kind of point out the difference, so oftentimes we talk about behavioral economics and then experimental economics. So if you have heard it phrased that way before, there is kind of a slight difference. And so I often say that behavioral economics is just kind of a theoretical side, and then experimental economics is basically just testing that theory in kind of a laboratory type setting, or it's, playing little games and actually looking at the behavior of people. So this is kind of a good direction to go if you're interested in bringing in experimental design into your classroom. It's a great way to get students thinking kind of about just the scientific procedures, like how do we actually test our theories? And then you can get into talking about what makes a good experiment a good experiment. And so we talk about things like random assignments. So it's the idea that if you are going to go out and test a theory that you have, you better have kind of a sample of people in your experiment that are sort of random, right? So you don't want to have, let's say, all females in your experiment, or all males, or people that are just in generally kind of homogeneous, right? You want to have a diverse set of, randomized participants so that you can attribute your results to what you're testing instead of the fact that they were, they're all freshmen and they're all kind of the same, type of participants, right? So does that make sense? You also want to have your students thinking about, okay, if I design an experiment, what do I have to compare to? So you might want to have them thinking about what your control group is, or what your controlled treatment is, so that they can actually get a comparison of results. Okay, so these are the similar things that you'd see in just that are brought up in your science courses when they're testing in a laboratory setting. So they would already talk about some of these things like a control group. Economic incentives are also really important in designing experiments. So if you had your students, for example, go out and design an economic experiment, you would want to make sure that whatever they're doing has a proper incentive. Because if we don't incentivize you properly to play our game, then you just make a choice you don't care, right? And so it's important for them to kind of think about, okay, what's going to incentivize people to actually make thoughtful choices. Okay, we also talk about information asymmetry, or kind of like making variations in experiments that change information for the people involved. So maybe you have one group who's presented with one set of information and another group that's presented with a different set of information. And then you can kind of find your own variations within that and say, well, how did that maybe a lack of information affect the results differently? Okay, so it's kind of a nice, getting into these experiments is kind of a nice way to go if you want to dig deeper and actually get your students thinking critically and getting creative. You can have them work in groups to design economic experiments, and I think it's just kind of good brain exercise for them. Okay, so to kind of like give an example of how one of these experiments or games might look, we're actually going to play a game in here. And so it's the kind of the classic example that we refer to in behavioral economics, and it's called the ultimatum game. And so this is kind of the general format, is when we play, I'm going to assign, we have 10 people, is that right? 3, 6, 9, oh, Jennifer, are you going to play? Okay, 3, and then 6, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so then we need 6. Is that right? So we're going to assign 6 people are going to be what we call proposers. And then our proposers have what we call a fixed pie, and they offer a portion of that to a responder. Okay, so if you're not a proposer, like she's handing out proposers, then you will be a responder. And so the proposer is going to offer what we are actually going to use our pencils. So we have sharpened pencils. And then did you hand out these? Okay. All right, so the proposers have their sheets and the responders have their sheets. And then this is kind of generally how the game works. So each proposer in their hands right now should have 10 pencils. And then your job is to offer to a responder who you don't know who it is, but you want to write down an offer, and you're going to say, okay, I offer you so many pencils. And then the responder is going to get that information from you, and they're either going to accept or reject. Now, if they accept your offer, then you both get what you originally offered. But if they reject your offer, you both get nothing. Okay, so the pencils go away. And then we're going to try and play this 2 rounds. And so if you just follow me on your proposer sheets, if you would just look at round 1, if you're a proposer, and write down what your offer is to your unknown responder. And then if you would also write your proposer number up in the right-hand corner of that sheet, just so I know who it's coming back to. Okay, so you would fill out for round 1 your offer, write your number up in the right-hand corner, and then that's it. Okay, and then once you're done, I'll take your offer from you. So then I'm just going to shuffle these and give them to the people who are not proposers. And so basically your partner here, this is what we were talking about, a random assignment. So you are theoretically should not know who it was that made the offer to you, because that could influence your decision, right? You have high schoolers in your class that are dating each other, and if they end up being partners, they're going to be like, yeah, I want, right? Or people who are friends or whatever. So you don't want them to know who the other person is. Okay, and then once I give this to the responders, you're going to circle accept or reject, and then I'll give them back to the proposer. And then you want to record what action you did. So now when I give that back to the proposers, you can see what your responder circled. And then you would record, if they accepted it, then you put in how many pencils you should get and how many pencils they should get. If they rejected, then you both get nothing, so you'd fill in zeros.
Him 3 pencils, is that right?
So, all right, so this is the way, so he started as a proposer. He has the original 10 pencils. And then when he writes in his box for proposer 3, and then in the next spot for responder 7, that means that he's saying, okay, I'm going to keep 3 because I'm the proposer and give 7 to the unknown person. That was his offer. Okay, so is everybody on the same page now? If we do it another round, it'll make sense. So if you are a proposer, then you write for proposer, that's what you want to keep. For responder, that's what you want to give away. And then when if you're a responder, if you receive that offer, you look at it. Are we on the same page about proposer and responder? Okay. So now do it again for a second round, and then we'll kind of see what happens. So assume 10 pencils again. So just a second independent round. Yeah, so it'll be random again. Right, yeah, it's random again. You could do it so that it goes back to the same person. And that we just have to keep track of like who was who when you collect and shuffle. Yeah. Okay, so then at this point, the proposers should get their response. And you should be able to see, how many pencils you get. So after the 2 rounds, look at what your offers were and look at whether people accepted or rejected. Now the first one, since we didn't quite fully understand who was proposer and who was responder, kind of look at the second round. And think about what were the offers that you made and what types of offers were accepted and rejected. So let me just open it up to you. So answer me this question. What do you think the theoretical result that we would predict according to economic thinking? What do you... Okay, any other thoughts on that? Theoretically, what should the proposer offer and what should the responder do? According to just economic. Okay, is that economic? Or is that?
There's no exchange. It's just giving.
Well, consider this offer. Let's say I'm the proposer, okay, and you're the responder. What if I offer you, I have 10 pencils and I offer you 1? What are you going to do?
And I get 0 and you get
So-
0 if I reject it.
Right, and what do you get if you accept?
I get 1.
And I get
9.
Okay, so what do you do?
I would say no.
She rejected me. Okay. Do you think that scenario, that my behavior and her behavior conform with what economic thinkers would predict? Why or why not? So in the one scenario where you accept, you get 1. In the other scenario, when you reject, you get nothing. My gain should be kind of irrelevant to you. Something is better than nothing. As an economic thinker, 1 pencil is better than none, so even though it sucks, you should take it. That's kind of the economic prediction, is that the proposer really, and the strict theoretical result is that they really should offer you nothing, and they should try to keep the 10 for themselves, and then you as the responder are kind of indifferent between whether I get the 10 or 9, you just accept. So 9 and 1 is kind of the more relatable prediction there. Does that make sense? So something is better than nothing. That's how an economist should think. But you brought up the idea of 5 and 5. So where does that come from?
I feel like it's from a graph I've seen somewhere.
Concept.
So the game is kind of like, I'm not a producer of pencils, that I'm not trying to sell you pencils. Pencils fell from the sky. I was told by someone up above that I can play this game. So it's not like I'm producing, so it doesn't have anything to do with like producer consumer surplus kind of stuff. It's just we're each trying to maximize our reward given the restrictions of the game. So it has more to do with this idea of fairness. That the fact that if I offer you 1 and I want to keep 9 for myself, that makes you mad. You don't want me to get the 9 because you thought I should have been more fair and offered you something like 5 and 5 or 6 and 4. So it's the fact that it's making people mad because you would hope that the other person would act in a more fair way. You're going to reject offers based on that emotion that you have. But it doesn't conform to what economics would say, take something if you can get it. It's that idea that people are rational thinkers and they respond to incentives and they should just kind of maximize their own reward. Yes. So, exactly. So that's the kind of behavioral side of it, is that people desire fairness. So in games like this, we see that kind of prediction violated, and then there's just a hilarious video to go along with that, to kind of show that even monkeys desire fairness, and it's very funny. Okay, so there you go, this kind of idea of fairness. It is lunchtime, so I will kind of stop there, but again, just kind of a fun game that you can use and just to kind of start these conversations about how people's emotions interfere with rational thinking. Change the game however you want, make variations. It kind of is a nice lead-in to like public policy discussions and how, you know, these things affect policymaker decisions. So if that's the direction you want to go, it's kind of a nice lead into that. It's a nice lead into wage negotiations. So kind of use it as your disposal. All of those things can be found on that Econ Ed link, and Jennifer will talk about that at the end of the day. So thanks.